And thank you for joining us. We're really glad to have you here. This was a webinar that we put together on pretty short notice, but we had a lot of interest, a lot of folks participating today, and I think I know why. And so as we get into the topic, it's a very timely subject. I'm John Williams. I'm a partner in our government contracts group here at Polaro Mazza, and I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague Kimi Murakami, who's a counsel in our business and corporate group. If you've heard me talk on one of our webinars before and about the firm, you know I always like to talk about the symmetries between our different practice groups, and I think that's one of the things that makes our firm so great. We have a government contracts group, and that's really been our bread and butter for 25 years. That's what I think we're most well known for. But we have other practice groups, including business and corporate, which Kimi is in. And the topic that we're going to talk about today really shows a nice dovetail or symmetry between those two practice groups, because there are business and corporate aspects of ensuring that you're compliant with NIST Special Publication 800-171, things you need to do from a corporate standpoint to best position yourself to be in compliance. And it's a government contracting issue first and foremost, because the compliance with this special publication is driven by the DoD DFARS clause that may be in your contract. So it starts as a government contracting issue and kind of morphs into a business and corporate issue, and that's something that both Kimi and I work together on for a lot of our clients. So with the housekeeping, and one other bit of housekeeping, the slides will be made available to everybody after the fact. We're also going to have the recording posted on our website for a little while afterwards, so if you want to share this with anybody or listen again, feel free. So we're going to start with a little overview here of what we're going to talk about today, and we're really focused on this NIST Special Publication 800-171. And you know, I think we caught everybody's attention, and you've probably seen others talking about this requirement too, because it goes into effect at the end of the year. So it's, you know, it's a very timely topic, and if you haven't been focusing on it up until this point, now all of a sudden you're seeing the lawyers and others out there beating this drumbeat, hey, you better be compliant by the end of the year. You may be thinking, well, what do I have to do? And does this apply to me? And I think that's probably the most important first question. Who has to comply? You know, who does this apply to? Does it apply to you? If it does apply to you, then we're going to talk about, well, what do you have to do to get into compliance? So first, we're going to make sure everybody understands who it applies to and who it doesn't. And then we'll talk about, for those that have to comply, what you need to do. But I would encourage everyone to stick on throughout the entire webinar. Even if during the first half you learn, well, okay, this doesn't apply to me, and you can wipe the sweat from your brow, it's probably going to apply to you soon, because it's probably going to apply to all government contractors in the not too distant future. So I think if you don't have to worry about it at the moment, that's great, but it's coming, and so I think this is something you want to have on your radar going into next year. Now we'll try to answer a few questions if we can as we move through, and we may, if we're lucky, we'll save a little time at the end to answer questions. So go ahead and use your chat box to send in questions throughout. All right, so the next slide popping up here, slide 5, you should see in a moment. Happy Cybersecurity New Year. I mean, that's again why this is a timely topic, because when the ball drops in Times Square on New Year's Eve, that's the deadline, 12/31. I mean, I guess technically it's, you know, the night before, because you have to be in compliance by 12/31/17. But you know, when we all wake up on New Year's Day with a hangover this year, some of us are also going to have a headache because we have to deal with NIST Special Publication 800-171. And hopefully, if this applies to you, you've been thinking about this and getting ready for it ahead of time. And because the clause isn't new, I think that's one misnomer, that this is a new requirement. This issue's been around for a little while, and you see here the DFARS 252.204-7012. So that's a particular DFARS clause that requires compliance with NIST Special Publication 800-171. That DFARS clause isn't new. It's been around, but it was changed last year to require compliance by 12/31/17. Now I think we're getting some a note here. Someone suggesting that there's a rumor. A couple people are suggesting there's a rumor that it's going to be delayed, that the deadline's going to be delayed. So that might be, breaking news, or at least something we had not seen as of the start of this webinar. So I appreciate the folks passing that along. So there might be, we'll do an update after this webinar if there's, once we can confirm that the deadline has been pushed back. But as of right now, the DFARS clause anyway says compliance by 12/31/17. But it's not a new requirement. This DFARS clause has been around for a few years, and this particular requirement was added in 2016. So the DFARS clause 252.204-7012 requires compliance with NIST Special Publication 800-171. So what is this 800-171? It was developed by NIST together with the National Archives and Records Administration. It's a living document. So what I mean by that is that it's going to be updated over time. And right now, the latest version is revision 1, which was issued in December 2016. It's geared specifically towards non-federal systems to provide standardized security requirements for protecting controlled unclassified information. So those are key terms, and we'll keep hammering them home, but just to start introducing them here, non-federal systems, it provides security requirements for protecting CUI, controlled unclassified information. And this is an outgrowth of Congress's direction to NIST and the Federal Information Security Management Act. And you can see here a couple of the sources where these security requirements are derived from. So a little bit more about 800-171. It's performance-based. So I think the idea was to avoid mandating specific solutions and to facilitate the use of contractors' existing security practices and systems. So as much as possible, allow you to leverage what you're already doing. And it's organized into 14 security families. So the requirements are grouped into these categories. And we're going to get further into this, but for right now, I just kind of want to give a high-level overview, because the first section we're talking about is really focused on who has to comply. So I don't want to get you too in the weeds on the requirements before we figure out if you have to worry about complying or not. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kimmy, and she is going to get into the weeds. But who has to comply? And again, I understand from some of the comments that maybe we have a little bit of an asterisk on 12/31/17 that's developing. We'll follow up on that with an update when the webinar is over. But according to the text of the DFARS clause, again, it's DFARS 252.204-7012. If that clause is in your contract and you own or operate a non-federal contractor information system, and you have CUI in that system, you need to comply. So, and this DFARS clause 7012, it should be in all DoD contracts, including commercial item procurements, except for contracts that are solely for the acquisition of commercial off-the-shelf items. So it's a pretty broad clause in terms of what type of contract or solicitation it applies to. So they're really, it should be, if you're doing DoD contracts, except for solely for commercial off-the-shelf items, it probably is in there at this point. But it's always a good idea to check, and that's really, when we get to the tips part of this, you always have to check your contract to see what what's actually in there, but it probably is. And a non-federal contract information system, obviously different from a federal information system, like a system that a contractor is operating on behalf of the government. They're different. This DFARS clause has different security requirements that apply to federal systems. So the NIST 800-171 compliance is for contractors that are operating non-federal systems, which is probably most of you who are listening. So CUI, so you have to have CUI in your non-federal information system to fall under the requirement. CUI is covered defense information, so it's unclassified, controlled, technical information, or other information as described in the CUI registry. So we've given you the link here for the CUI registry. And I think the key points on CUI is that according to the DFARS clause, the government is supposed to mark it or otherwise identify it in the contract or delivery order, or they're providing it to you in support of contract performance. So I typically tell people, because we get questions a lot, do I have CUI in my system? How do I know? Or I'm not sure. And we say, well, you generally speaking, you shouldn't have to guess, because the government should mark it. If you're not sure, you should talk to the government, the contracting officer, or your upstream contracting partner if there's someone else that is collecting or receiving it or providing it to you. Some real world examples of CUI, it's a broad category of information. It covers many different types of sensitive information. It's unclassified, so not classified information. And we've just given you a few examples here, just broad strokes, but just to give you a general idea of what it could be in your contract. So if the who does it apply to is really driven by being a DoD contractor with this particular DFARS clause in your contract, and then the type of information system you have and the type of information in that system, then obviously who it doesn't apply to are contractors that don't perform on DoD contracts contain that DFARS clause, because it's all about the DFARS clause in terms of this 12/31/17 deadline. So if you don't have the DFARS clause in your contract, it doesn't apply to you yet. If you do have DoD contracts and it just so happens that you don't have this clause in the contract, it's possible that the CO could modify your contract to add the clause. It won't. The clause won't apply retroactively, but they could modify your contract to add the clause, which would require compliance going forward. And the point I made at the outset about we want you to keep listening, even if at this point well, hey, I don't do any DoD contracts, so I can do something else with the next 30 minutes. I think you need to pay attention to this even if you're not doing DoD contracts, because we already have a FAR clause implemented last year, 52-204-21, that requires basic security safeguards. So it's a less restrictive, more basic set of cyber security requirements than what we're talking about in the DFARS clause. But 52-204-21 does contain security requirements that were based on NIST 800-171. It doesn't explicitly require compliance with 800-171. So there's nothing in the FAR right now that says, like this DFARS clause, you have to be in compliance with 800-171 by a certain date. We don't have that yet, but we understand that they're working on it. There's a FAR case, I think, I don't know exactly where it stands. Maybe some of the commenters will have some insights on how soon, where that is in the process. But our understanding is that that's been underway since earlier this year. So it could be as soon as next year, maybe, that we see a FAR requirement implemented or maybe proposed that's going to add compliance with 800-171 to non-DoD contractors. So I do think this is coming down the road for all contractors. I mentioned earlier that the DoD, the DFARS clause that we're talking about has to go into most DoD contracts, but there is an exception for contracts that are solely for COTS, for commercial off-the-shelf. And so we've given you the definition of what COTS is here. All COTS are commercial items, but not all commercial items are necessarily COTS. So I think that's an important distinction. But if you're doing contracts that are solely for COTS, then this clause, 252.204-7012, shouldn't be in your contract. And if it's not in your contract, then you don't have this 12/31/17 deadline. Now, if you have contracts that are not solely for COTS, or if you have some contracts that are solely for COTS, but you have other contracts with DoD that are not for COTS, then you may have it. You may have this clause in your contract. And all you need is to have it in one contract, and then your system needs to be compliant. So commercial items, we don't have a blanket exception for commercial items like we do for COTS. So, the fact that you perform on contracts for commercial items doesn't automatically get you around compliance. So chances are this DFARS clause will be in your contract. But just because it's in your contract doesn't necessarily mean that you're subject to it. Because again, we talked about before, you have to have a non-federal IT system, and you have to have CUI on your system. And the CUI, the government is supposed to mark it or identify or give it to you in furtherance of performance of the contract. And when DoD was implementing this DFARS clause in 2016, or at least updating it at that point, they recognized that on many commercial item procurements, DoD does not provide covered defense information to the contractor as a necessary component of performing a commercial item contract. So if that isn't the case, if the government does not provide CUI to you as part of a commercial items contract, then the clause may be in your contract, but you're not subject to it. So I think that's an important point. And that's also an important point for the next slide that's popping up on applicability to subcontractors. So the DFARS clause does require flow down to subcontractors, but only when the subcontract is for operationally critical support or CUI is necessary for performance of the subcontract. And I've given you, this is just a paraphrase of what is operationally critical support. But so if you're a subcontractor, many of you may do your work with the federal government as a subcontractor, and many of you may supply commercial items under that subcontract. The prime, your prime, might be reflexively flowing this clause down to you because maybe their subcontract with you just says that they're flowing down all requirements of the prime contract to you. You can resist the flow down of this particular clause if your subcontract is not for operationally critical support, or you're not getting CUI that's necessary for performance of the subcontract. Then that clause then shouldn't be in your contract, your subcontract, because you're not subject to it as a subcontractor. So, one of the things that we might see as a ramification of when this deadline passes, or if there's an extension, whenever the extension passes, is we may see more primes who now are more focused on this issue. They may start flowing this down more deliberately to subcontractors. It's probably already happening, but reality being that a lot of people wait to the last minute, maybe this is going to become more of a focal point for contractors next year. And so as a subcontractor entering into subcontracts, you're going to want to be more mindful of whether you should have to accept flow down of this clause. Because if you don't fit these criteria, then you don't have to accept flow down of it. And there is the DFARS clause does recognize that the contracting officer could essentially play the role of referee if there's uncertainty about whether the clause should be flowed down to subcontractors. I'm not sure how much they'll like being in that role, but the clause at least envisions that you can ask the contracting officer. Next slide popping up, applicability to small businesses. A lot of you may be small businesses and may be used to in other contexts that the government has carved out certain exceptions for small businesses. Certain things like cost accounting standards don't apply, or executive compensation reporting or code of ethics requirements, are either don't apply or maybe are easier to contend with when you're a small business. But unfortunately, there is no exception for small businesses in 252.204-7012. So if it's in your contract and you fit the criteria, then it applies to you and you have to comply whether you're large or small. When the clause was put into or updated most recently, the DoD did get some concerns from small businesses and about the costs of compliance and the difficulties of compliance. This is going to be more onerous for smaller companies, generally speaking, than larger firms. And one of the points that they made in response to that, of course, I think they appreciated the concern, but not enough to create any exception for small businesses, because from their point, the risk to the IT systems and the nation's information, et cetera, is too great to give small businesses a pass. And frankly, I think that's sort of the weakest link in the chain issue. Small businesses might be more vulnerable. So they didn't give any carve out, but they did say that, when compliance is necessary, that that should be clear in the solicitation, and because this clause is included, and that will give time to the small business to bring their system into compliance and negotiate the terms of the contract. So, query whether small businesses will feel like they have enough time, and how favorably you can negotiate the terms of the contract, building it into your costs and the schedule, and there's a process which Kimmy is going to talk about, and I'm about to turn it over to her, but there's a process for requesting a variance from the requirements. Maybe what you are currently doing are just as good as the 800-171 requirements, so you should be allowed to follow your process. Those are definitely tools that small businesses, that any firm subject to this can utilize. All right, so now as slide 16 starts popping up on your screen, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kimmy and let her start talking about, for those of you who have to comply right now, why is compliance so critical and what do you need to do?
Thanks, John. So if you have to comply, it's important that you do so, obviously, because it's in your contract. It can also give you a competitive advantage. If you're a prime, you can therefore comply and tell the agencies that you are in compliance with SP 800-171. Also, if you're a subcontractor, you can let the prime know it's another reason to select you because you're in compliance. Non-compliance, of course, could lead to what we call the parade of horribles. This is, for example, things such as damages because of a breach of contract, termination for default of your contract and reprocurement costs, negative past performance reviews, poor evaluation ratings, and also vulnerability to post-award protests if compliance was an evaluation factor in awarding that contract. There could be False Claims Act exposure and even suspension and or debarment. So these are all things that we're concerned about, and another reason why we think we had a good turnout today, because we want to make sure that you're compliant with SP 800-171. So I'm now going to get into a little bit about how to comply with this special publication. So the first thing, of course, is to examine the requirements that are set forth in SP 800-171. As John mentioned, this publication, I know it's a little thick, but it's organized into 14 families. Think of those as groups or categories, topics, and within each one, there are special security requirements. So what we would recommend starting out is that you do a gap assessment of what systems and practices that you already have in place and compare those against what's required under this publication. Your current system and practices that you already have may not be as far off as you fear. We had one question come in already about, well, if I already have complied with other requirements such as ISO 27001, or maybe you've been in compliance with NIST SP 800-53, which is a precursor to NIST SP 800-171. You may already be somewhat there. And one way you can check this is to look at a mapping table, which is actually provided in Appendix D of NIST SP 800-171. And there's a corresponding mapping table in Appendix C of another publication that I'm going to describe shortly. So again, we're hoping that for some of you, this may assuage some of your concerns about having to comply with this special publication, because already you might already be doing so. But you need to look at your policies against this special publication. You may be able to do it internally, in-house, with staff that you already have, may be able to look at this and do an assessment for you. Or if you need to consult outside consultants, we have some referrals and contacts that we could refer you to, so please let us know if you would like a referral. We do want to point out, however, that the regulation does not have a requirement that you get a particular certification of compliance. And that's very important too, because we don't want people going out and trying to maybe achieve or spend money to get a certain certification that's not required.
Yeah, I think we made that point because we've heard from several clients, and just sort of, the word on the street, so to speak, is that there are consultants or companies that are selling NIST 800-171 compliance certificates, as if it would be analogous to other types of internal process certifications that you might get as a government contractor. And so, the outside consultants or companies, as Kimmy said, we know several that, they will look at your system from a technical standpoint and help you understand where your gaps are, what you need to do to get in compliance from a technical standpoint with what the special publication wants you to be doing. But no one can give you a quote-unquote certificate that would be accepted by the government that, okay, you have the certificate, the seal of approval, so you're compliant, or that would, trump an actual review of your, system. So in other words, it's not going to be a get out of jail free card that you have a certificate from anyone. You're still going to have to, if you went under the microscope, so to speak, and they were looking at your system and your security practices, you're going to have to demonstrate that you're, meeting all the requirements you need to meet. You won't be able to wave around a certificate. So be a little bit careful about somebody that might be selling you a certificate, so to speak.
Right. And just the final thing that we have on this slide is that the cost of compliance should be allowable costs that you can include. So we also just wanted to make note of that as well. So to help you with the compliance, this slide should be popping up shortly. We wanted to point out a few resources that you may want to look to. One is a draft publication that came out on November 28th. It's NIST Special Publication 800-171A. So just make sure, because it can be very confusing, that you're looking at NIST SP 171, that's what you need to comply with. And then this A publication, think of it kind of as a companion guide that's supposed to be able to help you, and I think it does, with your assessment of whether or not you're in compliance. So this is a draft that just came out at the end of November, and it's open for a public comment period from November 28th until December 27th. And this is a tool, it's structured in parallel with NIST SP 800-171. It tracks the same 14 families or groups and the security requirements. And then it states what the assessment objective is and provides methods or ways that you can try and make sure that you're in compliance. It asks, for example, what should you be looking at? What do you need to examine? Who should you be interviewing or talking to within your company to make sure that you're in compliance? And what should you test when you're trying to perform the assessment? So it's a very helpful kind of guideline if you're going to do this internal assessment. Another publication that we wanted to point out to you is NIST Handbook 162. This guide is really geared toward manufacturers who supply products or goods in the DoD supply chain. But I wanted to point out this publication as well because it does have some additional information, particularly if there's something that you're concerned about or you're not sure if you're in compliance. Sometimes reading another way that it's described or how to achieve that security requirement can be helpful. So even if you're providing services and you're not someone who's doing goods or supplying different kinds of products, you're not a manufacturer, you may still want to pull up this handbook. We've given you the link there and take a look at it. Similar to the other 800-171A publication, it tracks verbatim in parallel with NIST SP 800-171, the 14 different families, the different security requirements, but again, it has some additional information there that might be helpful to you. It also says where you should be looking, who to talk to, how to perform tests to make sure that you're in compliance. So again, this might be something to help you, especially if you're doing an internal assessment of compliance. Going through this assessment and evaluating the policies and procedures that you have is clearly going to help you to determine whether or not you have to make some changes or update some of your policies and make some security decisions about your security plan. But we wanted to lay out here for you as an example some of the questions that you're going to be asking yourself. I think, again, hopefully this will make you feel better because I'm sure many of you are already doing these kinds of things. Do you use passwords? Do you require users to log in to gain access to certain information? If someone logs in multiple times with incorrect information, then are they blocked out? So again, this is just to give you an example of, I know you're going to be fearful when you have to go look at SP 800-171, but I think really it's fairly user-friendly using these assessment guides that we're pointing out as resources. It is something that we're hoping you'll be able to do internally, but again, if you need to go to an outside vendor, we have some that we can recommend for you. Also, as John pointed out, there is some flexibility with your compliance. So it's not as rigid as you might be concerned about as well. You're not expected to follow one defined path. And as John pointed out, that's why some of the requirements are performance-based, so that there is some flexibility here for you. And as well as he mentioned, you can request a variance in writing to the contracting officer. For new contractors, the DFARS clause 252.204-7008 indicates that a variance should be requested early in the selection process, and that way approval, if you're approved, can be included in the contract. Again, the DoD will consider an alternative if you think you have something in place that's equally effective. So, for example, if you're complying with the other NIST publication or with the ISO controls, that might be accomplishing what you need to as far as the security requirement as it's laid out in SP 800-171, and you can submit that in writing to the contracting officer, and it might take care of that particular requirement. So as John pointed out, because there's no exception for small businesses, and we understand this is going to be difficult and costly, particularly for many of you who are listening, very burdensome, especially if you don't handle a lot of CUI or CDI. Again, we're pointing out that really what you might have, your procedures and policies, could be actually what you already need. And you just have to confirm that by looking at the publication, and you may be able to leverage your existing systems and practices. In case you need a little more guidance, the DoD has suggested in an FAQ that came out at the beginning of the year on January 27th of 2017, and we've given you a link for that as well, that you can adopt a reasonable approach to try and make sure that you're compliant with SP 800-171. Again, we think this was done in response to their understanding small businesses are going to face challenges as far as costs and resources in being able to meet these requirements. I'm just waiting for the slide, some of the suggestions as to what might be included in trying to do a reasonable approach, as the DoD suggested, is to just look at, as we've already mentioned it, at your current policies and procedures and see, do we have what we need in place? Has your IT been configured securely? Do you need to get some new software, antivirus software? Again, I think many of you already have this, or additional hardware, such as a particular firewall. And then I put the resource here for you. Appendix D is a mapping table that you can look at what you have in place and directly compare it to the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 and check it against corresponding controls that you might already have. And also, we're hoping that many of you have the personnel who will be able to use these resources and do this assessment. We also wanted to point out that there are some other requirements that are set forth in addition to the one that we're all concerned about by December 31st or whenever the final deadline might be. So there are other requirements in this DFARS regulation. One is rapid reporting. This means that if you have a cyber incident that affects either covered contractor information systems or covered defense information or CDI, or that affects your ability to perform the requirements of your contract that are designated as operationally critical support or identified in the contract, then you have to report to the DoD within 72 hours of a cyber incident. In the regulation, there's a website that's specified on where you have to report to. It's known as DibNet. And you have to fulfill or complete what's called an incident collection form. And I'm pointing this out because there's about 20 or so different pieces of information that you have to provide in that incident collection form. And I just want to note this now because it might be something you want to take a look at, because again, if you have a cyber incident, you only have 72 hours to submit to DibNet. And so you're going to be very stressed out, you've just been hacked or something has just happened, and you want to make sure that you have that information handy so that when you call us or you call whoever you need to contact that this has happened, that you have that information in place. So I'm just pointing that out, that maybe it's a good idea to take a look at that information, and we'd be happy to provide it too if you need it. Another requirement is to preserve certain information so that the government can come in and inspect it if you do have an incident. So again, this is kind of an audit right that the government is going to have, and we want to make sure you've taken a look at that and make sure that you reserve or preserve certain information. Also, there are reporting requirements relating to malicious software, if that happens to be what happens to your company. So it's funny to me, but in the reg, it actually says do not send that malicious software to the contracting officer. So maybe that's happened, or they're concerned that someone won't have the common sense not to send that out. But again, there are other requirements in the DFARS clause if you have an incident that involves malicious software. Finally, there are very specific requirements having to do with cloud service providers and whether or not they're internal cloud service that you have, or whether you're using external cloud service providers. So again, we're pointing that out in case that applies to you, and we're happy to answer any questions related to that. We're not going to go into those right now, but it's very important to keep that in mind as another issue you might have to comply with. There are a few other additional tips that we have that John's going to point out, and ways that we can help and assist you in case any of this comes up for you.
Thanks, Kimmy. We got a question here that is very germane to the first point on slide 25 that's popping up for you. Somebody had asked that they have a contract and they're working on a military installation, and involves installation of computers and other equipment, and they're not sure whether or not they need to comply. And they're asking, should we check our contract? And I say, absolutely. That's the first place to start. You check your contract, see if the contract includes this clause, the 252.204-7012 that we've been talking about. And as Kimmy and I have both mentioned, there could also be contract-specific requirements in the contract, so it's not just a matter of doing a Control F for 252.204-7012, although that's certainly where I would start. But you want to look through the solicitation or the contract to see if there are also any contract-specific security requirements. That's your baseline. So, I mean, that's one of probably the main areas that we help clients with this, and looking at their contracts to understand what DFARS or FAR clauses are included, and what does it mean to be compliant with those clauses, and are there any special contract requirements beyond the DFARS and FAR clauses. So that's really critical, and that's an area that we get involved with a lot. But it's also your contracts with third parties, like your prime or your subcontractors or your joint venture partner. And I talked about this a little bit before, with the flow down issue. If you are a prime, you need to make sure you're flowing these requirements down as necessary to subject your subcontractors to the same requirements, because ultimately you'll be held accountable as the prime if there's an issue and you didn't flow it down to your subcontractor. And when the shoe's on the other foot, you want to avoid flow down when it shouldn't be flowed down to you. But it's not just a matter of flow down too. In these third-party agreements, you want to look at the allocation of risk, and that's things like your indemnification provision, which is probably part of the boilerplate that is a difficult slog to read in these agreements. But from Kimmy's perspective and mine, is some of the most important aspects of these contracts are, well, if there is a violation or an incident and damages ensue as a result, or the government takes an adverse contract action against the team, where's that risk allocated, and is the party that created the problem required to indemnify the other party if the problem causes some type of a damage to the other party? If that's not clearly spelled out in your agreement, then you may be left holding the bag if something happens. It wasn't even your fault necessarily. And I think in next year, when these requirements are fully in place and we're past the 12/31 deadline, I think you are going to see more of your contracting partners in teaming agreements and subcontract agreements specifically addressing both flow down and also allocation of risk and indemnification between the parties. Assisting with development of a written plan for implementing security measures, that's a big part of what we do, developing internal policies and procedures. I mean, there's obviously a large technical component of that, which is not something that we do here, but in terms of documenting and drafting the policies and procedures, memorializing the practices and the policies that you settle on as a company, that's something that we help clients with, and that's really the first step. After you've determined that you have to comply, when you know what's in your contract and what you're subject to, you need to have a plan. And I think, we've seen some of the comments, and I've been trying to walk and chew gum here while Kimmy was talking. And I think we'll definitely do some type of an update to our blog or announcement to everybody after the fact. But from what I've seen, there has not been a delay in the 12/31/17 deadline. The Undersecretary for Acquisition for DoD in a hearing last week made some comments about what small businesses need to do by 12/31 is have a plan and then show compliance to that plan. And obviously I'm paraphrasing, but I think she was trying to minimize, because one of the representatives had asked a question concerned about the impact on small businesses. And I think the Undersecretary for Acquisition was trying to show that, we recognize this will be challenging for small businesses, and we've been working with industry associations and, trying to get the word out, and we're here to help. And they understand it will be complex. And so what she said is that, and I'm going to quote here from her testimony, the only requirement for this year is to lay out what your plan is. And that can be a very simple plan, and we can help you with that plan. We can give you a template for that plan, and then just report your compliance to it. So I will tell you that is not what the DFARS clause says. So I do think that is the Undersecretary for Acquisition of DoD. So hey, if that's the official word on how they're going to approach it, then this is where the rubber meets the road, because we can tell you what the clause says, but I know a lot of you have had submitted questions about, well, what does it mean to not be in compliance? What's going to happen on January 1st? A bunch of people with badges going to show up and look at my IT system? There are going to be a bunch of contract terminations on January 2nd? No, I don't think that the world is going to change significantly for people as of January 1st. I don't think they have a big army of auditors that are getting set to go out and look at companies' IT systems. I think it's going to be like in most cases when you were talking about compliance, it becomes an issue when it becomes an issue. That something happened, and now the focus goes to, well, what did you have in place to prevent that from happening? Where you might see more of an immediate impact is on new contracts being awarded, that there could be a greater use of evaluation factors that are geared towards this. So you might start to see more discrimination in evaluation of bids between companies that are have been more proactive and on top of this than others. But if there is an incident, and we can point to this testimony from the Undersecretary saying all you had to have was a simple plan and show your compliance with the plan, that helps. But again, it makes me a little bit concerned, because that's not what the DFARS clause says. I think the point we're trying to get across about NIST 800-171 is that while it can seem daunting when you first crack it open, they tried to gear it towards leveraging what you're already doing in many respects. And so maybe that does lend itself to a somewhat simple plan, but I wouldn't take away necessarily simple plan meaning like a one-page document and then you're totally set for all the 14 security families and things that I think it's going to be a little more extensive than that. I have not seen this template that the Undersecretary mentioned in her testimony. She concluded at that point by saying that she would provide something to the representative's office So this was the representative who had been questioning her about this. So we can follow, Kimmy and I can follow up with the representative, I think it was, Senator Shaheen, to see if the DoD has provided anything along those lines. We don't have a template here per se. We have plans that we've helped specific clients prepare, so we could absolutely help you put a plan together, but we don't have a template per se. We don't have anything posted on our website that we can just give out. If that's something that the DoD is working on, though, then yeah, especially for small businesses, that'd be great, and it'd be nice if that would be issued. We're getting to the 11th hour here, and we don't have it. I've seen some notes come in. They'd like to see links to the testimony. I think we'll do a little follow-up after this, a note to everybody who participated, and we'll put a link to the testimony. You can go to the Armed Services Committee's webpage and work your way to it, but I'll get you a more specific link after the presentation. So insurance, we've had clients talk with us about having gotten cybersecurity and online property insurance. That's something that you can explore. Preparing and negotiating variance requests. This is the other area that I think is an important part of the process that we can be involved with. It's really like a comparable to a request for equitable adjustment or a claim on your contract. That's how I would view it, because you're submitting a request that the government either relax or remove some of these requirements. It's going to make it easier for you to comply. So you want to put together a strong case for why you shouldn't be subject to certain requirements, or what you're already doing works. And, if the sentiments that the undersecretary expressed of, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, we want to work with small businesses, we don't want to make it too onerous on them, simple plan, etc., then I would like to think that they will favorably receive variance requests. But you have to ask. I think the situation you don't want to be in is after the fact saying, oh, well, I didn't do those things because I didn't think they applied to me. Better course of action is to put a letter together that says, I'm not going to do these things because they don't apply to me. Please confirm that you agree. And if you do that proactively and as early in the process as possible, I think you're going to be in the best shape from a compliance standpoint. Because, we look at all of these things through the prism of being a responsible contractor. If anybody tries to question after the fact that you weren't doing everything you could to be compliant, having a plan, absolutely, but the plan may not be able to cover everything, but you may have good reasons why that is, and you want to ask the government to agree with what you're doing ahead of time. Easier to do it before then than after the fact. And it's not just a matter of having a security plan. You also want to make sure that your corporate policies and procedures reflect that plan and emphasize the importance of the plan, that you have buy-in at all levels, that it's part of the employee handbook, and so employees are trained on it, and you can demonstrate all of this, because again, it goes to if something hits the fan after the fact, you're demonstrating everything you did to be a responsible contractor and to do your best. Somebody made the point, and I agree, isn't this one of the commenters, isn't it funny that the government is imposing this on contractors when the government has a hard time of keeping its own system? And that's why they're doing it. I mean, because it's the weakest link in the chain issue. But it's a point well taken that if somebody wants to hack, they're going to hack. There isn't a foolproof way to avoid cyber incidents. So I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is as much as we can do to demonstrate good faith effort and good faith attempts to comply with a solid plan that we stuck to as best we could, that all our people understood it was important and we trained them on it. And then if something happens, and we respond as quickly and as well as we can, but at least we were prepared for it ahead of time. I think that's the idea behind these last points here. And I think that's bringing us to the end here. We've answered many of the questions. We have a lot. So I think what we're going to do is we've got some follow-up that we need to do to get everybody a link to the Undersecretary's testimony. And I think what we'll do here is many of the questions are very specific to a particular company, and there's a request here to post all of the Q&A. I think we'll sift through the questions and try to post answers to the ones that have general applicability, so we're not outing anybody's specific situation. And so we'll look to do that as soon as we can. A couple more questions have come in. I see here about templates. Like I said before, we don't have a template. We can certainly help you to prepare a security plan and to update your handbook and policies and procedures, but we don't have a template we give out. I'll be very curious to see if the DoD has one that will start to be circulated. So we'll follow up with Senator Shaheen's office to see if they've received anything yet from DoD, and we'll include that in our update. So we'll stay on top of it, and we really appreciate all the good feedback from folks. There's a lot out there, and so it's helpful to get the input from everybody and all the questions. Appreciate your participation, and we'll be in touch with more information soon. Thank you very much.